Hello, this is Michael Hexter, and welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. So, this episode I'm calling U.S. Climate Left Caught Between Neoliberalism and Old Left Models of Change. So, this is actually a reflection on a couple events in the last couple of days I attended in person. Um, One was a meeting in Brooklyn, Williamsburg, Brooklyn, at PTT. It's a or PIT. I'm sorry. It's a radical anarchist, mostly or anarchist-inspired bookstore, and also record store. It's with some very nice vinyl records there as well, and but a whole basically a lot of radical books there, and also a meeting space as well, which the owner generously provides for various authors and groups to hold talks. And so at this talk, this was about degrowth, or what would New York look like in under degrowth, or with a degrowth policy framework. And Aaron Van Singen, who is an author with Andrea Feta and Matthias Schmelzer, of a book called "The Future is Degrowth: A Guide to a World Beyond Capitalism." It's out on Verso. So he had come down from Montreal, and Jamie Tyberg of Degrow New York was one of the organizers, and then there was a third person from DSA from Queens on the panel, and the sequence was Aaron talked first, and then there was I believe it was the person from DSA, and then I believe it was Jamie who talked last. And so that was one event. And the other event was the Fridays for Future demonstration today. That's the 3rd of March, 2023, and which was, or climate strike. And I was able to attend some of it. And so I, got a sense of what was going on. I saw the some of the speeches and so forth and so on, and some of the sort of the dynamic of the march slash discussion or speaking. And it wasn't particularly large on international scale. It wasn't a particularly large march. It was maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people at most, probably less. Many of them high schoolers and middle schoolers in New York, and which was good that they were out. And but it was not a huge march, and went from City Hall basically in Manhattan, and then across the Brooklyn Bridge to Brooklyn Borough Hall. So anyway, both of these events, just to sort of go back briefly to the event at PIT in Brooklyn, which is short for Property is Theft. So that's a good way to remember PIT. So anyway, the way that event sort of turned out, so I appreciated the start of the discussion. Aaron started the ball rolling, the author of the Future is Degrowth, or one of the co-authors, and then the second person was talking about some concrete issues about power plants, peaker power plants located in Queens, and the resistance to that because of asthma, among other things, in that area. And also you could see a climate element to that local resistance, and the involvement of DSA in that. And so, but then the third person, I believe, which was Jamie, um, but I don't want to, started to talk in very general terms about basically Marxism, Leninism, and democratic centralism, and organizing according to that idea. And basically, it took me and another audience member and several audience members, but the audience was mostly people in their maybe 20s and 30s. But then I'm older than that by a good bit. And then another gentleman also was there, and there were a few other people who were slightly older. But anyway, it took me back to the 1980s and 70s and so forth and so on. I wasn't really active in the 70s at all, but the history, what I understand of the history of, and what I've read and not read just, but experienced in my own long history on the left in the United States, and that these, it appeared as though this person thought of themselves as basically a commissar of the meeting, and was asking, talking about science as if talking about dialectical materialism, I believe, as quote unquote a science, and that she had a scientific, and she could determine the correct line, so forth and so on, straight out, and basically in a extremely problematic way and extremely old-fashioned way, in the sense of it was creaky old Marxism Leninism as far as I was concerned, and saying that she was represented a revolutionary standpoint, and was representing, I don't know, she didn't use the word the masses, but one could assume that she, and talk about democratic centralism and so forth and so on. So basically the entire it seemed like many people in the audience had never encountered this kind of talk and this sort of theory, and she basically had zero to do with, as far as I was concerned, or almost zero to do with degrowth, and also social metabolism, which is what Aaron had started talking about, and which I was eager to see a discussion of that in the context of New York, or maybe more generally in the United States, and or for that matter globally, but and what one could do in the form of a politics that took into account degrowth, or the notion that we can and should be living off a much lower level of at least material and energy flow in the developed countries, and in particular the United States and Canada, but living well and living prosperously in a way where prosperity is not measured by the total energy flow that one uses, and material flow that one uses or one owns, but by quality of life. And so anyway, that discussion was not broached very much, or we didn't really get it, because many in the audience became fascinated with this idea, or not fascinated, but this sort of controversial, you could call it, typical Marxist-Leninist revolutionary talk, and democratic centralism and so forth and so on, became, how can one organize either centrally, or can it be democratic, and can, what do you do with a minority, and so I believe it was Jamie, I don't want to, I'm pretty sure it was Jamie anyway, and I believe she was representing an organization called Degrowth NYC. I don't really want to either say that was for sure who she was representing, and who that, because the person in the middle, I'm forgetting her name, or anyway, but whoever it was and whatever her name was, the third person who talked derailed basically the meeting so it would nothing in the way of the notion that about social metabolism and so forth and so on, and just apportioning of, material energy throughout the world, and through, in this case also in New York. What would that look like in New York? It never got started. We got basically derailed, and so this is unfortunately a pattern that one sees on the left of people who are part of vanguard parties, or consider themselves to be part of vanguard or want to be vanguard parties, i.e. Marxist-Leninist parties, glomming on to issues that are of more general interest other than Marxism-Leninism, which is not of interest, and justifiably so. There are reasons why we shouldn't be organizing according to that. There are historical disasters associated both with, I think Marx bears some, as I discussed on Politics 2100, Marx bears some responsibility, or the Marxist framework does. He doesn't. He's dead. He's long dead. There are many Marxists who attempt to say, well, Marx didn't intend all the bad things about that happened in Marxism. I'm sort of, in the middle there. I think some of it can be attributed to faults in Marx's philosophical / political / economic framework. But and then Lenin's revision of that to create his the vanguard party, the Bolshevik party, and then eventually the Communist Party, the Soviet Communist Party, and so forth and so on. Anyway, the the groups that adhere to that, which there still exist, there are people who, the third person who talked was someone who was maybe 30, maybe 35, maybe 25. But anyway, unfortunately and heartbreakingly, a younger person's spouting the old, not good, not helpful, lines. That continues, and then so that was on Thursday night, the 2nd of March, and then that meeting, and then on the 3rd was the Fridays for Future March, which is an international phenomenon if you're not aware, but happens every Friday really in some places. But this Friday was a supposedly a particularly large demonstration. And anyway, at that demonstration, I witnessed, so basically there were many school children, or high schoolers, and there were some older people, some of them from Extinction Rebellion, and which is a newer phenomenon. Extinction Rebellion doesn't really have a model of change, okay, or it doesn't at least have one that has caught on and is articulated in a way that there are good people in Extinction Rebellion, doing interventions. But anyway, but that they were few actually. But more obvious to me was some older, mostly men, but anyway, some women, I guess, but mostly men, who were leafleting for system change, not climate change. And so, which, in theory, yes, we need system change in order to address climate change. Absolutely. I'm on board with that. But these people are parts of sects, various Marxist-Leninist sects that have very, very pat solutions that are, that it's about basically diverting the participants in any given larger gathering attention to the building of revolutionary socialism through Marxist-Leninism, so on and so on, that kind of thing. And I think that we've seen all of the issues related to that, including the ignoring of, in the history of that political philosophy, the ignoring of the environment of, degradation of environment that happened, in great abundance in the Soviet Union and Eastern Germany, in Eastern Europe, so forth and so on, there was no value or very little value placed on the environment or the preservation, the stewardship of the environment in those countries. Not to say that every country has followed exactly that path, that has a Marxist-Leninist background, and or that has a history. Once, like for instance, the Chinese Communist Party or the Vietnamese Communist Party have been equally. The political leadership of countries like that can decide our values are X, Y, and Z, and to some degree, if depending on how, but their economic model needs to also change, and they would need to also make that a national project, which would deviate from or divert from the standard line that one sees coming from most, communist / Marxist-Leninist organizations. And again, I'm not to say that, because politically, I'm someone who believes that it's through politics and cultural change that is also spurred by politics, or that is in communication with each other, that we will, address these crises. We will discover how to design our societies so that they, we are not exhausting the earth, and we are stabilizing our relationship with the earth, and with each other, with our own exploitation of each other and of ourselves, that we will discover via politics, that also is a cultural movement as well as a politics. So, but that's beyond, that language is beyond, or is Marxist-Leninists might look at that and try to subvert that, okay, and make it part of their program and their interest in power, and their desire, their thirst for power as individuals and as a party, but they are not so self-conscious to see their own thirst for power, and basically the endpoint of their denying the endpoint of their if they were to succeed to seize power, to create a dictatorship, okay, which is what happened, and not a dictatorship of the proletariat, a dictatorship of a party, composed of mostly middle class or bourgeois origin intellectuals of various kinds, and so some of which have done good things in some countries, and I got into an argument with some younger people at this bookstore event who were throwing at me Cuba and so forth and so on. I said, yes, I didn't get into the nitty gritty of what I think about Cuba and what happens and happened in Cuba, but I don't throw away also the results of all of the experiment, the massive human experiment, the massive social experiment of Marxist-Leninism, communism, so forth and so on, from 1917 to today. I don't throw it all out and say it's all bad, it's all terrible, so forth and so on, but a lot of it is terrible. Okay, enough of it is terrible for us not to want to follow that path, and not to want to just cookie cutter in a way, just try to basically say, oh, okay, you guys being the people at an event that's about climate change, you guys have your false consciousness, and I'm going to, the cadre from the party are going to, make your conscious the true consciousness being what I think, and what the sort of the basically standard stale Marxist-Leninist ideology. So anyway, so what I also said, neoliberalism is also a very big um, issue in climate politics, and most climate politics has been um, caught in neoliberalism. The whole Kyoto mechanism is peak neoliberalism. It's about creating markets that supposedly you're going to solve social problems or economic problems, and creating new markets, and it's failed miserably, and uh, and this continues on. When, for instance, I didn't hear all of the speeches at the rally at the end of the climate strike march, but they were talking about climate finance and talking about um, getting banks to changing the rules of banks so they didn't finance oil and extraction, so on and so on. So I'm not against, trying to work within the framework of private capital and or corporate responsibilities, so to speak, and making banks act in a corporately responsible way. Private banks, um, it's not a total waste of time, I don't think, but it's also missing the huge engine of change that has of government action, and spurred by popular demands, and but also leadership that is prepared to take let the government take a leadership role in the economy, and not banks, and not even highly regulated banks, private banks. So that's not instituting rules that are ESG rules, so on and so on, environmental, sustainability, and governance, investing, what's being demonized by the right wing now in a way that's sort of almost this. It's so far right that it's against even what I'm talking about is neoliberal or left neoliberal talk about getting banks to finance the future, so to speak, rather than finance the old dirty past. Again, it's not a wrong thing to do. But it's wrong to, in my opinion, for politics to be centered on climate politics to be centered on trying to get private capital to build our future, and it's just, we need public investment, massive public investment, public leadership that will justify, in other words, a politics, an ideology that people can share and say, we want government to do these things. It's not against our view of the world for government to be doing positive change to, among other things. In my framework, there is both growth and degrowth in a transitional economy to what I would call a circular economy. There's growth in certain sectors and degrowth in other sectors. The polluting sectors degrow rapidly with regulation, taxation, government expropriation or purchase or nationalization of certain properties, and then stepwise dismantling them. So all of these things are part of a discussion that unfortunately people are not having in. I say these things occasionally, and where I've written them in the past, and there may be other people who it sort of peaks up in certain places. It's not all original with me, but I came to some of these things on my own, but it's not only me that thinks about these things. But anyway, that process of needs to be part of a broad public sphere, a left public sphere discussion of those actions that we want government to take. But that's not what's being demanded. Another flash, card, image of the talk that was was happening at the climate rally was there was a young Nigerian American speaker, maybe a high school or maybe college student, I don't know, but anyway, who was talking about basically sort of straight socialism. Okay, a socialist, radical, anti-colonial, not DSA socialist, but I don't know, maybe I don't know if they're part of a group, a ML group, a Marxist-Leninist group, or not. But anyway, it was very standard, and it wasn't talking about again this change of both social metabolism that we need to create a circular economy, a climate stable economy. So talking about the real resources that we have and the real actions we have to take to make that stabilization. So that was not part of the discussion. And then, I mean, the idea was, of course, if they heard me talking about it, they say, "Oh yes, I'm for that," or maybe not. Maybe they wouldn't say, but or I'm generally for, or I have my other idea about that. But we weren't talking about it in the context of the demonstration. So the excitement was they were trying to spur these young people, very young people, to be excited about an old idea and not about how do we get to this climate, how do we address the climate crisis, how do we take steps, and or if it is a revolutionary solution we need to still build if it's based on climate catastrophes and climate demands as well as social demands and economic demands that people have that are unfulfilled and in our current system, it still needs to be said and needs to be opened up, and you need to show yourself to be capable of addressing those things by knowing about them and by addressing them and saying, like, government should be doing this and that, or our future revolutionary government, whatever that is, would be doing X, Y, and Z, and not just sort of, and not magically, sprinkling on socialism dust, okay, like magical, like fairy dust or whatever, but using words that are just old incantations, you could say, or references to past struggles or whatever it is, but I'm calling them incantations and magical thinking because they're not addressing the social metabolism issues and the distributional issues related to that too. I mean, there's class conflict there. There's international class conflict, and there's regional and there's local class conflict, regional, and there's national, within a nation, our wealthy, relatively wealthy nation, and so all of those things. But it's specific to, and there were moments when, again, in the talk on Thursday night, there were moments when that kind of distributional issue was sort of fit in with the climate. So there were moments of that, but then there was a return to the safety of these sort of like, oh, we're building just the good old time socialism kind of thing, or we're just returning to the ideas and not focusing on an approach that is going to get us there, either by radical steps now, big steps now that making demands that government can't, transitional demands that are either if government complies with it, they in the way become the grave diggers of the current system, but they, transitional demands that are non-reformist reforms, or as some people call it. So one way or the other, I mean, we got to be reducing our output of emissions and waste, and solid waste, as well as toxic solid waste, as well as greenhouse gases, and so forth and so on. So and anyway, so I think this is something, that if I were to be having a dialogue with someone, it might become the argument could maybe, but who was, open to having a dialogue or debate, I could maybe expand on this idea, and or maybe it seems amorphous. So this is where the lack of this kind of discussion, or at least let's say there are groups that have come and gone, or that have surged, that seem to promise, for instance, the climate mobilization, which is a group that I have been involved with on and off, or tangentially, that seemed to have some promise, but then it kind of fizzled, and then the Sunrise Movement seems to sort of have kind of faded into the background. So we really have, I don't know if it's it seems to me as though in Europe there is more of a focus on with Just Stop Oil, with the Ukraine war, with the energy crisis over there. They seem to have focused more clearly on and the Russian and trying to reduce their dependence on Russian gas and oil. That has sharpened, as they say, the contradictions, but focused people on at least starting toward this model of change where we focus on, well, how are we going to actually transition to a climate stable economy and a just economy. So anyway, I just wanted to share some of these thoughts and these perspectives, and I don't consider what I'm relating at all controversial for anyone who's read anything about the history of the left, the environment, about environmentalism, about the facts we have about the climate. It's not rocket science. It's just simply we need to gather our information, then act according to it. But it seems as though people just sort of then leap to these old models, or to neoliberalism, or somewhere in between, And so, and just sort of a small parenthetical digression, and this will be the end of the video. There's also the Green New Deal framework, okay, which sort of encompasses much of, or could encompass much of what I'm talking about as being a real step, but it is mired now in a kind of vagueness. Okay, the Green New Deal could either be something very minimalist and not very, it could become co-opted by the Democratic Party or by some other, in other countries, centrists, vaguely center-left parties, into becoming something very bland, or it could be a very deep and far-reaching transformation of our economy, and also our society, also social transformation. And right now, it's kind of this vague. It seems to be caught in sort of stasis, at least in the United States, and where it kind of was born, the idea. And some of that has to do with Sunrise Movement's kind of, stalling or fading into a background role, and maybe it's inherent in that organization's sort of lack of theory about how to really transform an economy, and how government works, and how government could work potentially, and how social movements interact with government, and so on and so on. And again, they did some good work that I supported and I applauded in 2018, 2019, but it hasn't progressed very rapidly from there, and I think that some of this has to do with politics within the Democratic Party, and also the politics of elected representatives being the leaders, and they're needing to be sort of sway with the political winds in a way that is not conducive to pushing forward with this vital project. So I'm going to stop here, and I hope I shared some thoughts and insights and observations that were interesting to you. And please like the video if that was the case. And also please share your own thoughts and reactions to what I'm saying here in the comments. And also please subscribe to Politics 2100 if you're finding it interesting and worthwhile. So see you in the next video.